Well, that was a trip. I think it's appropriate we just covered Suikoden 1 because there's actually a lot of similarities between the two games. While Suikoden 1 was a first game on the PS1, this is a first game on the SNES. Appropriately, Suikoden 1 felt a lot like an early SNES RPG because of the aforementioned problems, whereas this feels like an early NES RPG because of the aforementioned problems. One of the biggest things the game tends to shove into your face is the grind. But let's discuss that briefly, because it's not just about encounter rates, but also about just the sheer quantity of how many encounters that you actually get, because Could you stop that, please? The amount of encounters isn't just the problem by itself, because a lot of older RPGs have the too high encounter rate problem. This is something I've talked about before. Systems can layer on top of other systems, and the way that they interact tends to really make some really great gameplay. But it can also go the other way. It can make some really terrible gameplay. So if you have high encounter rate with enemies that don't give a lot of experience or gold, in an area where the stuff is very expensive to buy, and it takes a large amount of experience to level, while making it so that the enemies are substantially higher level than what you should be at any given point in time, what you have is a recipe for disaster. Because at this point, it's not just grindy in the traditional sense, it's grind on top of grind on top of grind. The game literally expects you to run in a circle at several separate points in the game and just level for a while, because the difficulty curve is designed around such a concept. Keeping in mind, up until pretty much the very end of the game, the final stream I did, I wasn't skipping any encounters and was killing everything in my path, and in several cases was getting lost or otherwise going through an area again or whatever, and I was still drastically underleveled the entire game. That says all it really needs to, I think. Now, that sucked, but then there's the irritation of the combat, because you go into combat, and there's no memory cursor, first of all, so that just sucks. It sucks even more because there's not really a lot of options in the combat. You have the ability to fight, the ability to cast spells, the ability to use items, that is it. Now, you might say there's a lot of other RPGs that do the same thing, and you'd be right. But the lack of options doesn't help anything, and then there's the fact that, generally speaking, there's only really one thing you're going to be doing, especially on boss fights. You drain, then you attack, and you cast your biggest spell. And that's kind of it. All the rest of your time and attention is spent on recovering from the massive amount of damage the boss is doing because you're underleveled. So that's fun. So combat isn't fun, and it's irritating to control, but then we add on to that the fact that it takes forever. Because, okay, I'm exaggerating slightly, but it takes a minute to get into combat, then it takes a long time to get through combat, then you get out of combat, and then you have another encounter 2 steps later, like I was demonstrating earlier. So, I don't know what else to add to that. Combat is boring, not rewarding, and constant. Now, there's a reason I'm hammering this point over and over again. It's because it's most of why this game sucks to play. It's why we decided to finally just pull the cheat flag and get on with it. Because, off the top of my head, I'd say this run would probably be about maybe 10 to 15 hours longer of just running in a circle if I decided to actually just sit and grind and do it legitimately. Not great. This is on top of the fact that most of the boss designs aren't, and most of the dungeon designs aren't. So, I could mention other things. I could talk about how you're forced to walk in a dungeon for some reason. I could talk about how the puzzles usually involve flipping a switch. I could talk about how the overall design isn't, and how there's no real flow or guidance to where you were supposed to go. I could talk about how the game periodically actually tells you literally wrong directions and where to go. I could talk about how several of the teleport options are mislabeled. I could talk about how the map. Did you notice that there is no map? And that would have helped a little bit, because in several cases, especially with how zoomed in the camera is, and it doesn't do the FF4 trick where it kind of zooms out a bit, FF4 does predate this game. In fact, FF5 predates this game. In fact, Secret of Mana predates this game. To give you an idea of where you're going, but no, you're stuck in here kind of guessworking. This is especially bad since until you get the airship, you're still running into encounters that whole time, which are draining your resources, your time, and your ineffable, the few seconds left in your life before you finally tumble into oblivion. You spend random encounters in Lufia 1. Sorry, I'm upset. Not really upset, but I am upset because this is the exact same thing that I hate most in game design. It is wasting my time. So surely there's something that makes up for it, right? Actually, yeah, there's a couple of things. So first of all, I do want to mention that the intro to this game is actually very strong, both on a story axis, but also on a gameplay axis, because you go through the intro and it gives you what's referred to as a taste of power. You have access to most of your spell arsenal, and you have characters to go through the high-level enemies and effectively fight the last bosses of the game in terms of stats and equipment. So that's cool. It gives you an idea of what you're going to be working up towards. That's good. More games in general need that. I've talked about this before, because if you don't do that, what you have is Kingdom Hearts syndrome. Now, I know that's a bad term for it, and I don't care. But I think of that because every time I think of the opposite of, a taste of power, what I think about is Kingdom Hearts 1. Most RPGs are boring at the beginning, not because they're badly designed, but because there's nothing to do. What are your options? Swing your weapon, jump. That's it. It takes a while for you to really get the kit going, and then the game can actually be fun. A Taste of Power bypasses this issue by making it so the player isn't bored early on, and they have something to look forward to. Oh, I can't wait till I can cast that spell, or use this ability, or have this attack, or whatever, right? So it's a good way to kind of avoid that overall issue, which is what this game does. So credit on that front, definitely. I'll also say that making the overall narrative, I know we're drifting into narrative already, but making the overall narrative, they beat, the legendary hero's time has come and gone, and now you're just kind of now-whatting. That's good. I like that, and that caught my attention as well. But another thing I like is kind of the spells. So a lot of games, a lot of RPGs make it so that magic is one of three types of things. It's either a big cooldown, or it's ammo, or it's part of your regular rotation. Now, the big cooldown is obvious. I'll point back to Suikoden 1, where you have 8 casts of your basic ability, 4 casts of your medium, and 2 or 1 of your big spell, right? That's made up numbers, but you get the idea. You have very few casts of that. But each of those spells does tons of damage and is very worthwhile. So, cooldown, it's not supposed to be used regularly. It can also be seen as ammunition. This is more like what the Final Fantasy series does. You have a decent amount of ammo, and some ways to replenish that ammo, but ultimately, you have a limited clip, and so you have to be careful and precise about what you cast and where. Obviously, this varies from game to game. But then you very rarely have a game where magic is so common and so prolific you have tons of it. It just becomes part of your normal rotation. Most of the spells in this game cost anywhere from 2 to 8 MP in a game where you have hundreds of MP to burn. And that works. That's true even early on in the game. And it stays true all the way to the end of the game. So your spellcasters are always casting. They never have to default to, meleeing or wanding, for those of you who played WoW Vanilla, for another example of that. So that's good. I do like that, and I do think that works. I also think some of the music is okay, and I do like the way they use the fast travel system. Being able to just warp out of a dungeon and warp to a town, that's actually a good system, and I like that. And that's about all the positives I have. What's really sad to me is fixing the gameplay in this game would be extraordinarily easy. It wouldn't make the game good, because the core combat of this game is still very basic. Like I said, NES RPG. But at least it wouldn't be horrible if you smoothed out the encounter rate, changed the reward that enemies gave, rebalanced the actual enemy design themselves, rebalanced how much experience you gain from levels and how much stats you gain from levels, and honestly, there you go. Boom, done. That would take some time, but I'm pretty sure that a fan could sit down and mash that out in a week if they had an editing tool. So, what about the story? It's okay. Yeah, I know, you were expecting some big turnaround, but the problem is Lufia 1 story is not that great. It is a first game, which is a NES RPG. So I'm going to go and put up the spoiler flag in 3. So the story of this game is, it's there. I will admit the premise caught my attention, and I do like how the game, it does several things right. it makes it feel like you're actually playing in a world that has nothing to do with you. There's little inferences and interactions with the NPCs that are completely separate from your main quest, which helps to flesh out the world you're playing in. There's also decent banter between the main party, so while none of the main party members really is substantial enough to even be considered to have a character, the way that those characters bounce off of each other is actually pretty good, so points there. I also like how the game drifts into making this feel like it's down to earth in a weird way. Even though we're going to defeat the Sinistrals to save the world, the fact of the matter is most of the time we're just kind of ground-level adventurers doing what we can, usually with local problems. And that works. That's, again, it's part of the overall idea of now what. It also ties very neatly into the dominant theme of the work, which is... I'm going to use the word that I used in my review document, which is complacency. The game mentions that it's been 99 years of peace, and everyone sucks. And I was expecting to give that a negative because I dislike the idea that peace by itself makes everyone suck. But the game didn't do that. Instead, it's very clear that most people just kind of suck because they have chosen to. They don't really want to do their work. They don't really want to defend their area. They don't want to send out troops to the local town that needs help. They don't want to actually personally go and see if anything's wrong with the nearby town. They don't really want to try and get the ingredients themselves for cooking, and they don't really want to try and make sure that they have proper chefs within their own kingdom for cooking, and so forth and so on. It's a non-stop thing. Virtually everyone in every major town in the entire game is just content to just kind of lounge about and not bother with anything. The most on the nose that this ever gets throughout the course of the game is, I forget the name of the town, but it's the one where there's the ruby, which grants you wishes. And it's fake, which I liked, actually. And they were just using it as a tourist trap to try and kind of as an alternate tax. You know, people who come in and toss money into the pool and be like, hey. So it brings in tourism, and it brings in citizenry who pay money in order to be able to get their wish granted, which, of course, the wish isn't granted. But that not only is surprisingly intelligent, but it speaks to how, let's call it, unstable that the economy of that nation was getting. Because if most of the people were just relying on this orb in order to grant their wishes, they weren't working, they weren't doing, they weren't progressing. The game calls this out flatly and says that most of those people were just kind of letting things fall to the wayside. It's vague, and it doesn't get a lot of attention, not the kind it should, but again, NES RPG. So instead, you just get the inferences and the ideas that this place's industry and agriculture and general function was just falling apart because everyone just kind of more and more was just wishing on this stupid orb and letting that deal with things for them. I do like that overall theme, and it's an interesting understructure to the rest of the game, especially since the game tries to spend much more time and attention on its big twist, that, surprise, Lufia is Aram, the Sinistral of Death. What? I put the spoiler flag up earlier. Honestly, this is actually foreshadowed pretty well, surprisingly so. And I do kind of like what they do with it. Rather than it being a twist for a twist's sake, instead it's mostly about how the characters react to it. The main character is, of course, in complete denial about the entire thing, and the local pragmatist, who is literally a military official, is already thinking about killing her in order to solve the problem, but can't quite bring himself to say that because, of course, she's his friend too, so that makes sense. And, of course, Lufia herself is completely freaking out over this, as she should. She's spent the last, I think it's 9 years living her life as Lufia, and all of a sudden, yeah, surprise, that's not who you really are. That being stated, I do think that one of the mistakes the game makes is it tries to have a good ending without really knowing how to do that. We get to the end, Aram has gone ahead and switched to the Sinistral side, and Deus is there, and he's like, I'm evil, and Gades is like, I'm evil, and Amon is like, I'm evil. And then Aram's like, wait, I don't want to be evil. And so then we fight the incomplete final boss, shades of the Game Boy Color game there. And once we do that, Lufia's like, no, I must die, otherwise they'll always come back. No. And then she dies, and then we get to 1 year later, out of absolutely nowhere, and we get some of the worst dialogue in the entire game. But then it turns out she's okay. Everything's fine. And the game tries to basically cheat by saying, no, she's totally Lufia now instead of being Aram. Except we know that's not how that works, and we know that's not true. The whole problem was the fact, again, ignore Lufia 2 for a moment. Even ignore Lufia 3, the Game Boy Color game. Even within this game in particular, we saw that defeating Aram doesn't really do it by itself, and that she will come back, and then the others will come back. Now, you might say that's fine, but I just personally disagree, because what we have then is a status quo that can't be altered. I would have actually been fine with it if there was some way to permanently alter the status quo and make it so the Sinistrals won't come back in the future, but instead, it's just a cycle and we just get to live with it. So that sucks. But otherwise, I hated this game, and I hated playing through it. Normally, irrespective, I enjoyed it, but no. This game was barely tolerable. We had some fun making fun of it. Chat was able to keep us invested in talking about other things, but the game itself, I will never play this game again. Tomorrow, actually, I'm not sure when this video will go live because I'm leaving like in 10 minutes, but whenever, Monday, whenever that is in relative to now, when you see this, we'll be playing Lufia 2, which I hope to God is a better game. See you next time.